the launch of book The Beaver and the Dragon. Written by Dr. Charles Burton and published by Dean Baxendale's Optimum Publishing International. Before we start the event, I would like to thank the president of Central Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center, Diki Shugla, for helping us organize this event at this beautiful Tibetan center right here in Toronto. Charles was sanctioned too. By China as well as Russia, right? It's a double sanction.
Yeah, double sanction, yeah. I've been sanctioned by Russia too. Maybe US next.
And I would also like to acknowledge Dr. Maria Chong and the team. Chinese President Xi Jinping often says that the world is experiencing great changes unseen in a century, referring to the perceived decline of the West and the rise of China. I cannot speak for a full century, but I can certainly attest that we have witnessed a profound shift over the past decade across democratic countries, including right here in Canada. There is now a broad consensus shared by parliamentarians from across party lines, academia, the media, civil society, that the Communist Party of China can no longer be regarded as a friendly or trustworthy partner. This shift did not emerge spontaneously. It's the direct consequence of the CCP's own actions. Coercive diplomacy abroad, human rights abuses at home, aggressive expansionism, political interference abroad, and disregard for international norms. In other words, the CCP itself has created the very global environment it now complains about. So coming back to the remarks on China, such actions were not always very obvious. They came packaged under various guises, often sounding very benevolent, such as poverty alleviation initiative, the great rejuvenation of Chinese nation, non-interference in internal affairs, socialism with Chinese characteristics, mutual respect, a multipolar world, and a community with shared future for mankind. It took experts to see through the realities of such policies and principles. And one such expert who has done an incredible job exposing the CCP's facade in Ottawa for decades is Dr. Charles Burton. Now, the difficult part is giving Charles a very worthy introduction. And fortunately, we are joined here today by Charles' publisher and our mutual friend, Dean Baxendale, who's going to introduce Charles and the book. So I'll do a very simple introduction of Charles. Charles has been a friend of Tibet long before I joined CTC in 2018. Charles has worked with my predecessor, Carol Sandel, and currently with our current chair, Sampet Halumpa, as the senior advisor on China affairs to CTC. I've had the chance to collaborate with Charles on several occasions, including at the meetings with the Global Affairs Canada, which is Canada's foreign ministry, on top program at the Canada's think tank, including at the McDonald Laureate Institute, and now this event with the Optimum Publishing International, who's represented here today by its CEO, Dean Baxendale. Speaking of Dean Baxendale, I will give a very brief introduction. Dean Baxendale is, teasingly I just said, a Canadian James Bond, but he's a Canadian publisher, media executive, a human rights advocate. As the CEO of Optimum Publishing International, he has championed investigative books, including the bestseller Willful Blindness, that expose corruption, authoritarian influence, and erosion of democratic freedoms, particularly in China. Dean has worked with exiled journalists, whistleblowers, and dissidents to bring truth to light, often at a great personal and professional risk. His commitment to press and freedom and human dignity continues to resonate across borders, including among Tibetan diaspora and beyond. So with that, I'd like to invite Dean to give his remarks on the book, and I want the speaker, Dr. Charles.
Sharap, thank you for that. Can you hear me, or I don't know? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. It's a great pleasure to be back here in the Tibetan Community Center. As many of you know, we were here a couple of years ago. We launched the China Nexus with Benedict Rogers. A number of you were here for that event. Thank you for being there. And I also had two close friends, Daniel Swidani from the Solomon Islands and Celsus Talafilu. I do have some sad news to share in that Daniel Swidani passed away a couple of weeks ago, but doing what he does best, fight the Chinese Communist Party and trying to restore freedom and democracy in the Solomon Islands. So, with that in mind though, thank you for joining us for the launch of the Beaver and Dragon. I want to especially, once again, thank you, the Tibetan community, and media colleagues who understand that truth-telling is not an act of journalism. It's an act of resistance, of courage, and of national responsibility. Today marks an important moment, not just for Canadian publishing, but for Canadian sovereignty. Let me begin by extending sincere thanks to those who made the launch possible. First, to our editor, Kevin Kavanagh, whose sharp editorial insight helped bring clarity, credibility, and integrity to every page that Charles wrote. To Sharap, whose dedication to community and justice made today's event a reality. Your work behind the scenes has been invaluable, so thank you. I also wanted to bring you special words from Senator Condonino, whose health is at this time getting a little frail, and he wanted to extend his best wishes to all of you here at the Tibetan Community Center. He loves Tibet. He's been my mentor, as you know. I've learned a great deal from him, so he wanted to extend his thanks to all of you. So today, I want to take a moment to honor a man who's done more than almost anyone in the country to understand the motivations and to expose the malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Charles is a sinologist, a former Canadian diplomat, a respected public intellectual. For years, he's been warning Canada through his columns, his policy analysis, and testimony before Parliament that we are dangerously behind in recognizing the scale and scope of foreign infiltration into our society. In fact, this past Thursday, Charles testified in Parliament yet again with searing clarity. He said, and I quote, "I just don't want any Chinese spies to be operating freely in our country. The fact that we don't expel any of them, we don't make any of them persona non grata, or bring their proxies to Canadian courts to be made accountable for these alleged activities, I think sends a signal to China that Canada's open territory for this kind of thing." Many of you in this room understand that statement. And let's be clear, that doesn't just go to Beijing, it goes to Washington as well. Charles rightly asked, if Canada won't act against foreign agents operating openly on our soil, how can our closest allies trust us with deeper military and intelligence cooperation? It's a good question. He also laid bare the numbers. China has 176 diplomats stationed in Canada, vastly more than we have in China. And as Charles pointedly said, again, and I quote, "Are Chinese diplomats so inefficient," they probably are, "that they need such large numbers to engage in legitimate diplomatic function? Or is it that about 70% of them are engaged in espionage, influence operations, harassment of Canadians of Chinese origin, and other things that are not consistent with their diplomatic function?" End quote. These are the kinds of questions the Beaver and the Dragon demands we confront honestly, urgently, and without apology. This book is not an academic exercise. It's a wake-up call. It's an historical roadmap for understanding how Canada, often unknowingly, sometimes willfully, allowed its institutions, businesses, and political class to be courted, compromised, and in some cases, co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party. Perhaps for win-win trade, or perhaps many intellectuals simply can't fathom that the Chinese Communist Party is run by many bad actors. But this is also a book about what we can do through policy, public awareness, and principled diplomacy to reclaim our democratic foundations and protect our national interest. As the publisher of this important work, I can say without hesitation, this is the most consequential Canadian book on documented China's history in foreign interference, influence, and ambitions for global hegemony in a generation. And we are proud to launch it here first with you in the Tibetan community, who understand, perhaps better than anyone, what happens when a nation's sovereignty is traded for silence. when your country is run over and your spiritual leader must flee Tibet. To our Tibetan brothers and sisters, your long struggle for dignity and recognition is not forgotten, certainly not at optimum. Your voices are part of this story too, and we are listening. To Canadians, the Beaver and Dragon is more than a title. It's a choice. Do we continue down a path of economic dependency and diplomatic naivety, or do we defend what's ours and align with those who share our values and our vision? Charles Burton has given us the truth, and tonight Charles will give you some great insights and entertain you with his wit and knowledge. Charles will be available, of course, to autograph copies of your book, and we're going to do a Q&A session afterward. Thank you again, once again, for coming tonight, and please read the book, share it, and let it be the catalyst for real, lasting change in this country. And with that, I give you my friend and colleague, Dr. Charles Burton.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean. First of all, I'd like to express my thanks for the very generous and kind words that have been said today about my work and about me personally. And it's wonderful for me to see so many old friends at this event. For me, spending day in and day out analyzing what's going on with China under the Chinese Communist Party's dictatorship is frankly very emotionally draining. And I feel so saddened and disappointed by the greed and naivete of Canada's Laurentian elite's betrayal of Canada in their tacit consent for Xi Jinping's infiltration of Canada and the Chinese Communist Party's corrosive undermining of humanitarian law. So your very generous and kind words give me a lot of encouragement and strength. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm very grateful to my dear friend and collaborator, Sheriff Burton. Sheriff has put in many hours into arranging and publicizing this event today. He has been a wonderful friend to me. Dean Baxendale proposed this book project in the first place and has been very dedicated and hardworking in promoting the book and the principles of Canadian justice and integrity that my work stands for. My good friend, editor, and agent of more than 17 years now, Kevin Kavanagh, whose name is on the cover of the book, is not able to be here tonight. Some people who read my columns, since 2009, with the editing of Kevin Kavanagh, I've produced over 200 opinion pieces in the Canadian National Press. And they say, "Oh, you write so well." Actually, that compliment should really go to Kevin Kavanagh, who has revised and improved every word in the book. Moreover, much of the content and approach to China has come through our 17 years of often daily back and forth. It's been one of the great joys of my life to work with Kevin, so I hope he'll be watching one of these podcasts or videos or all the stuff that's going on with all you people recording it. Let me just say, in 1964, Chairman Mao Zedong wrote a letter to a student in the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing who had asked him for guidance on music composition. And Chairman Mao responded with the famous 8-character phrase, 古为今用, 扬为重用. It means make the past serve the present and make foreign things serve China. I think it would be fair to say that my career has looked at those two aspects of first, how China's traditional culture impacts Chinese politics today, and second, what Western things shape China's modernization and contemporary social values. As I talk about in the book, when I was briefly detained by the Chinese Ministry of State Security in Shanghai in August 2018, much of the interrogation was focused on my interaction with scholars in Beijing who disagreed with the Chinese Communist Party's legitimating discourse that China's Confucian culture demands autocratic rule by Xi Jinping as an emperor-like despot. Those scholars said that there is another tradition in Chinese thought, beside Confucianism, called Taoism. And I wrote my thesis in China at Fudan University on interpretations of Taoist philosophy in China after 1949. To those scholars, the contemporary relevance of Taoism is that it calls for small government. The classic Tao Te Ching, written by Lao Tzu, says that ruling a large country is like cooking a small fish. Taoism can be seen as supporting civil society, the rights of autonomous citizens, and participatory democracy, and not imposing assimilation from above on non-Han peoples, including the Uyghurs and Tibetans. The Taoists are happy for Tibetans to go their natural course and be Tibetan. I was shocked that the Ministry of State Security regarded me as such a dangerous subversive for talking about the relevance of Taoist tradition to contemporary Chinese politics. I mean, I was not surprised that the Ministry of State Security was not happy with me, but I had not expected Taoism to be their number one issue. After I left Fudan, I was active in the 1980s, supporting colleagues in Beijing who were publishing books that supported China's democratic transformation. So my name appeared on the flyleaf of these books in English characters, Charles Burton, before 1989. The publishing house that I was affiliated with was wound down after 1989, and my colleagues fled the country. After that, I coordinated a massive 5 years collaboration between Canada and China, between the Royal Society of Canada and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, advising China on how to restructure China's political institutions to bring them into compliance with the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. China had finally signed on to that covenant in 1998. Then in my second diplomatic posting in Beijing, I was involved in what was called the Civil Society Program. I led that program to try and support the emergence of a non-governmental organizations in China to create a sense of citizenship in Chinese people that would lead to a movement to establish democracy from below. In 2005, I was commissioned by the Government of Canada to write a report assessing our bilateral human rights dialogues with China. And I went to Lhasa as part of that dialogue process. My report was the subject of 2 years of committee hearings in the Parliament of Canada, the upshot of which was Canada cancelled our collaboration with China in the Human Rights Dialoguing Initiative. Then finally, over 4 years until 2013, I visited at the Central Party School in Beijing, primarily focused on discussion of policies towards ethnic minorities. So the Chinese were considering how to learn from Canada in the management of Tibetans and Uyghurs. That was when Xi Jinping was the president of the Central Party School. All of these initiatives, which involved a very large amount of Canadian taxpayer money, we estimate that for the CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, Good Government, Democratic Development and Human Rights Programming, Canada invested over $1 billion Canadian dollars over those years. Hours and hours of time went into that, but I can't come up with a single benefit to China and China-Canada relations that came out of this work on promoting democracy and human rights, or trying to give the Chinese information about how they can make their society more compliant with universal norms of human rights. That work took up an enormous amount of my time and energy over a period of 40 years. And the upshot is that China under Xi Jinping today is more repressive, brutal, and autocratic than China under his predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So where are we today with Canada-China relations? As you know, a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Carney met with President Xi Jinping in Korea. As an updated barometer of the relationship, Xi's terse statement at the meeting made it clear that Canada is a supplicant to the Middle Kingdom, that Canada has been wrong and Canada will change its ways. He said, the Canadian side has expressed its willingness to promote the development of bilateral relations in a pragmatic and constructive manner. The Chinese side is willing to work with the Canadian side to push Canada-China relations back onto the correct track of sound, stable, and sustained development at an early date. Our Prime Minister, in a subordinate role, rather like, a student listening to a teacher, echoed the Chinese messaging, repeating 3 times the phrase pragmatic and constructive, and said that in engagement and dialogue, but constructive and pragmatic, those 2 words, are staple Chinese propaganda words for not criticizing any Beijing actions that violate international norms. In domestic terms, it's like China would be able to interfere in Canada's democratic processes or provide benefits to Canadians who are influential in policy formulation so they advance China's geopolitical interests in Canada. So we're really giving a tacit consent for these activities. Internationally, it would mean not challenging China over Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea, Beijing's support of repressive autocrats in the Third World by providing them with surveillance technologies to suppress democratic forces in their countries. We should assume that under the Canadian constructive and pragmatic program, that Canada would no longer speak out about China's policies of genocide against the Uyghurs or its violation of the language, cultural, and religious rights of Tibetans and other ethnicities. But it was Carney's final words before the leaders went into their meeting that was the most revealing. He said to Mr. Xi, "We will establish a road to seize the great many opportunities between our countries and also to have a platform that's needed for the dialogue to help build a more sustainable and inclusive international system." Well, the sustainable and inclusive international system language is Beijing's favorite terminology describing China's planned New World Order, the community of the common destiny of mankind, that will buttress its rise by 2050, as she promises, as a global hegemon, supplanting a fading United States as the sole superpower. China has already mapped out the rising and falling of empires. China plans a world that abandons liberal democratic principles of the post-World War UN Charter to human rights, international law against genocide and torture, and the equal sovereignty of nations. Shortly before Mr. Carney met with Xi at the South Korean APEC conference, Cody Blois, the parliamentary secretary of the Prime Minister, had been in Beijing along with the Agriculture Minister, Keith MacDonald. The eventual Prime Minister's office statement about the Carney-Xi meeting said that both leaders directed their officials to move quickly to resolve outstanding trade issues and irritants. These irritants, as they put it, certainly includes Canada's strictures against China, such as limiting access to mineral resources in Canada's north, particularly to critical minerals, and removing regulations that prevent China from legally exporting Canadian dual-use military high-tech. Obviously, the spark behind Ottawa's outreach to China on Chinese terms is Donald Trump's economic and diplomatic belligerence. As Trump sheds the trading relationship that has been the bedrock of Canada's mercantile economy, Ottawa is under pressure to quickly find new partners and markets, and this is something China has the power to deliver. If Canada agrees to revive the free trade negotiations bungled by Justin Trudeau in 2017, or even to join in China's Belt and Road Initiative global infrastructure program to remake the world in Beijing's favor, China could decide to buy much more Canadian grain, remove the tariffs on Canadian canola that currently impacts very negatively on 40,000 Canadian Western farmers, minerals, lumber, by buying less from countries such as the United States, Australia, or Brazil. And if we do the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been broached by the Asia Pacific Foundation as a possibility, China would invest big time in Canadian infrastructure. But does this reset of our bilateral relations with China, the recalibration, as Mr. Carney puts it, in a pragmatic and constructive manner, lead us to not just moral, ethical betrayal of our Canadian values, but also by allowing unfettered Chinese infiltration of our society threaten Canada's future sovereignty and security? We have a lot of concern about infrastructure. There was an article in the National Post the other day about Chinese Internet of Things potential for poisoning our water in times of conflict. It's a very concerning situation. As the Christian saint, St. Matthew, put it in the Christian Holy Bible, he said, "What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" So I think that we have to be concerned about the soul of Canada in the face of a very strong challenge by a very powerful emerging power. Now, just to finish off, I'd like to read very briefly from the book one brief article that I published in the Globe and Mail on July 3rd, 2020. This was one of the few of my opinion pieces that led to a rebuke on the Chinese embassy website, so obviously it was a successful one. It's entitled, "The Chinese Communist Party is Not Very Chinese at All." And, even though it was written more than 5 years ago, I think you'll see that I could have written it yesterday. The way the Chinese Communist Party depicts it, rising tensions between China and the West are due to a declining Western civilization led by the United States, attempting to beat back the inevitable rise of China. We are assured that Chinese culturally based non-liberal ideologies and non-democratic institutions offer great promise for future global prosperity and justice under Chinese leadership. But as someone who has lived his life between China and Canada, I'm deeply troubled by the prediction of inevitability of a winner-takes-all clash of superpowers starting very soon. Are there really no universal values to bind us in our common humanity, as Chinese President Xi Jinping insists there are not? If Mr. Xi is so confident in the superiority of his repressive program of socialism with Chinese characteristics, why is there so much secrecy, brutal suppression of political debate, and digital censorship in his domestic and international policies? Why is there so much dissembling and disinformation in his regime's engagement with Western governments and the public? For example, Mr. Xi suggests that there is clear and solid evidence that both Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are spies. For what? For Canada? Falsely claiming that their arrest is neither arbitrary nor politically motivated on the one hand, while on the other hand unable to provide any information that suggests different, and urging that the Canadian media and politicians seek pressuring them on these points with our so-called megaphone diplomacy, seems a very feeble and painful approach, and frankly, not very Chinese. In the 1970s, I was honored to be the first foreign student admitted to the History of Ancient Chinese Thought program in the Department of Philosophy at Shanghai's Fudan University since the 1960 Sino-Soviet split. All of my professors had just returned to campus after years of imprisonment and forced labor in the Communist Party's great proletarian Cultural Revolution campaign. With enormous good grace considering the circumstances, my kindly and generous teachers readily took me as one of their own. What they taught me was that China's cultural greatness, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, lies in the immutable principles clearly and simply expressed in the classical Chinese of the ancient sages of China's Confucian tradition. I learned that honesty and integrity are the most important traits that Confucius repeatedly emphasizes through his Analects, the Lunyu. In his discourse on honesty, Confucius stretches how being sincere gives individuals the integrity necessary to make progress along the way. He writes, "Be sincere and true to your word, serious and careful in your actions, and you'll get along even among barbarians." That's us. But if you are not sincere and untrustworthy in your speech, frivolous and careful in your actions, how will you get along even with your own neighbors? But what we get out of the Chinese Communist Party today is dishonesty and insincerity. Kevin and Julia Garrett, who were brutally held for almost 2 years from 2014, and like Mr. Kovrick and Mr. Spaver, also falsely charged with ill-defined espionage crimes, were also just innocent pawns in the Communist Party's pathetic and contemptible hostage diplomacy. There is no valid reason for China to bar Canadian canola seeds or wood imports into China. They just made it up. The prison facilities holding huge numbers of Uyghurs in Xinjiang are an appalling violation of human decency, amounting to genocide and nothing else. COVID-19 was not brought to Wuhan by US forces participating in the military World Games the year before, as Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian alleged. And the national security law for Hong Kong is simply a betrayal of China's commitment to maintain Hong Kong's freedom and rule of law until 2047. These are the indisputable facts of these matters. The alternative narratives coming out of Beijing are inconscionable, perfidious bafflegab. If the party seeks to devastate the international rules-based order, then be transparent and open about it. It's a betrayal to claim that the party's lies are true to Chinese cultural imperatives. In this sense, the Chinese Communist Party is ultimately not very Chinese. My respected Fudan professors are all gone now, their lives shortened by the torture and the political persecution they suffered in the 1960s and 1970s. But I am confident that if they were still around to mentor me, their unpresuming Canadian student, they would tell me that liberal democracy and the defense of human dignity is actually the true Confucian way in this modern age. Thank you very much.